Dean Arnold Corll, known as the Candy Man, was a serial killer who, along with two teenage accomplices David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, kidnapped, tortured, sexually assaulted, and murdered at least 28 teenage boys and young men between 1970 and 1973 in Houston, Texas. Using his friendly reputation from giving out free candy to children to lure victims to his home, where he would tie them to a plywood torture board before killing them either by strangulation or shooting with a .22 caliber pistol. Dean Arnold Corll was born on Christmas Eve, December 24, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. His birth into what would appear to be an ordinary American family masked the troubled childhood that many believe contributed to his later transformation into one of America's most notorious serial killers. The story of Dean Corll begins not with violence, but with the seemingly normal struggles of a family trying to make their way through the challenges of the early 20th century. His parents, Arnold Edwin Corll and Mary Robinson, were a young couple who had married with hopes of building a stable family life together. However, their relationship was marked by constant conflict and instability from the very beginning. The household that young Dean was born into was characterized by frequent arguments, financial struggles, and an atmosphere of tension that would pervade his earliest memories. His father, Arnold, was a man who struggled with his own demons and found it difficult to provide the kind of stable, nurturing environment that a growing child needed. The first major disruption in Dean's life came when he was just 6 years old. In 1945, his parents divorced, shattering what little stability existed in his young world. The divorce was traumatic for Dean, as it is for most children, but it was made worse by the uncertainty that followed. Like many children of divorce during that era, Dean found himself caught between two parents who were struggling to rebuild their lives while dealing with their own emotional turmoil. However, this was not the end of the upheaval in Dean's early life. In a move that must have been confusing for the young boy, his parents decided to reconcile and remarry in 1950, when Dean was 11 years old. This reunion brought the family together again, and they made the decision to leave Indiana behind and start fresh in Houston, Texas. The move to Houston represented a new beginning for the Corll family, a chance to leave behind the troubles of their past and build something better together. For a brief period, it seemed as though the family might find the stability they had been seeking. Dean, now 11 years old, had to adjust to a new city, new schools, and new friends. Houston in the 1950s was a rapidly growing city, full of opportunities for families willing to work hard and build a life for themselves. The Corll family settled into their new surroundings, and for a time, things appeared to be going well. However, the underlying problems that had caused the initial divorce had not been resolved, and by 1953, when Dean was 14 years old, his parents separated once again. This second separation was perhaps even more devastating for Dean than the first divorce had been. As a teenager, he was at a crucial stage in his development, forming his understanding of relationships, trust, and stability. The repeated cycle of his parents coming together and then breaking apart sent a message about the unreliability of human connections that would stay with him for the rest of his life. During this difficult period, Dean's mother, Mary, met another man and began a new relationship. This meant that Dean not only had to deal with his parents' separation, but also had to adjust to the presence of a new male figure in his mother's life. For a teenager who had already experienced so much instability and change, this was yet another challenge to overcome. The constant upheaval in his family life had a profound impact on Dean's emotional and psychological development. Unlike some children who become outgoing and sociable as a way of coping with family problems, Dean became increasingly withdrawn and isolated. He had difficulty forming meaningful friendships with his peers at school, and his academic performance suffered as a result of the emotional turmoil he was experiencing at home. Adding to his social difficulties was a health problem that would plague him throughout his childhood. At the age of 7, Dean was diagnosed with rheumatic fever, a serious condition that affected his heart and left him with a chronic heart condition. This illness required him to miss significant amounts of school, which further isolated him from his peers and made it even more difficult for him to form the kinds of friendships that are so important during childhood and adolescence. The rheumatic fever not only affected Dean's physical health, but also had a significant impact on his social development. While other children his age were playing sports, participating in after-school activities, and building friendships through shared experiences, Dean was often confined to bed or restricted in his activities due to his heart condition. This forced isolation meant that he missed out on many of the normal childhood experiences that help young people develop social skills and learn how to form healthy relationships with others. Despite these challenges, Dean's mother, Mary, was determined to provide for her family and create a stable life for her children. She was a resourceful woman who understood the importance of hard work and perseverance. During this period, she began to explore various business opportunities that might help support the family and provide them with the financial security they needed. It was during this time that Mary Corll made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for the entire family. A traveling salesman who called at their home noticed Mary's skill at baking and suggested that she might be able to turn her talent into a business opportunity. He pointed out that her homemade pies and other baked goods were of exceptional quality and suggested that there might be a market for such products. This conversation planted the seed of an idea that would eventually grow into the family candy business. The idea of starting a candy business appealed to Mary for several reasons. It would allow her to work from home, which meant she could continue to care for Dean and his brother while building a source of income for the family. It also represented a chance to create something positive and wholesome, a business that would bring joy to children and families in their community. The symbolism of a candy business was not lost on Mary. It represented sweetness, childhood happiness, and the kind of innocent pleasures that she wanted to be able to provide for her own children. As Dean moved through his teenage years, the candy business began to take shape. Mary worked tirelessly to develop recipes, find suppliers, and build a customer base for their products. The business was small at first, operating out of their home and serving primarily local customers, but it represented hope for a better future and the possibility of financial stability for the family. Dean's role in the early days of the candy business was minimal, as he was still focused on completing his education. However, he was present during the development of the business and witnessed firsthand the hard work and dedication that his mother put into making it successful. He saw how she interacted with customers, how she took pride in the quality of her products, and how she gradually built a reputation in the community for producing excellent candy and baked goods. In 1958, Dean graduated from Vidor High School. This achievement marked an important milestone in his life, as it represented the completion of his formal education and the beginning of his adult life. However, unlike many of his peers who went on to college or immediately found employment in other fields, Dean's future was already largely determined by the family business that his mother had worked so hard to build. After graduation, Dean began working full-time in the candy factory that his mother had established. This transition from student to full-time employee marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that would see him take on increasing responsibility within the family business. The work was demanding but satisfying, and Dean found that he had a natural aptitude for the various aspects of candy production. Working in the candy factory also provided Dean with his first real opportunity to interact regularly with other people outside of his family. The business employed several people, and Dean had to learn how to work as part of a team, communicate effectively with coworkers, and develop the kinds of professional relationships that are essential in any business environment. These experiences were valuable for someone who had struggled with social isolation during his childhood and adolescence. During this period, Dean also began to develop the skills and knowledge that would eventually make him an integral part of the candy business. He learned about production techniques, quality control, customer service, and business management. His mother recognized his potential and began to give him more responsibility within the company, grooming him to eventually take over significant aspects of the operation. However, this period of relative stability and growth in Dean's life was interrupted by family circumstances that required him to make a difficult decision. In 1960, when Dean was 21 years old, his grandmother in Indianapolis became seriously ill and needed someone to care for her. Dean made the decision to leave Houston and the candy business temporarily to move to Indianapolis and provide the care that his grandmother needed. This move to Indianapolis represented another significant transition in Dean's life. For 2 years, from 1960 to 1962, he lived in Indianapolis, caring for his elderly grandmother and temporarily putting his career in the candy business on hold. This period of his life was marked by responsibility and sacrifice, as he gave up his own plans and ambitions to care for a family member who needed him. The experience of caring for his grandmother was both challenging and rewarding for Dean. It required him to develop new skills in caregiving and to take on a level of responsibility that he had never experienced before. It also provided him with a different perspective on life and relationships, as he saw firsthand the importance of family loyalty and the value of caring for those who cannot care for themselves. When his grandmother's situation stabilized and he was no longer needed as a full-time caregiver, Dean made the decision to return to Houston in 1962. He was eager to rejoin the family business and to continue building on the foundation that his mother had worked so hard to establish. The candy business had continued to grow during his absence, and there were new opportunities for expansion and development. Upon his return to Houston, Dean found that the candy business had indeed flourished during his time away. His mother had continued to build relationships with customers, expand the product line, and establish the company as a respected name in the local candy market. Dean was able to step back into his role within the company and immediately began contributing to its continued success. However, Dean's return to Houston also coincided with significant changes in his personal life and in the broader social and political landscape of the early 1960s. The country was going through a period of social upheaval, with the civil rights movement gaining momentum, the Cold War creating international tensions, and traditional social structures being questioned and challenged in ways that had never happened before. It was during this period that Dean's life took another unexpected turn. In 1964, despite his heart condition and his important role in the family business, Dean was drafted into the United States Army. This came as a surprise to Dean and his family, who had assumed that his heart condition would exempt him from military service. However, the military medical examination determined that he was fit for service, and he was required to report for duty. Dean's mother, Mary, was determined not to let the military take her son away from the family business that they had worked so hard to build. She immediately began working to secure a deferment or exemption for Dean, arguing that he was essential to the operation of the family business and that his absence would cause significant financial hardship for the family. However, these efforts were unsuccessful, and Dean was required to report for military service as scheduled. On August 10, 1964, Dean Corll was officially drafted into the United States Army. This marked the beginning of what would prove to be a brief but significant period in his life. The military experience would expose him to new people, new ideas, and new aspects of his own personality that he had never explored before. Dean's time in the military was spent primarily at Fort Hood, where he attended radio repair school. This technical training was well suited to Dean's abilities and interests, and he performed well in his studies. The structured environment of military life provided him with a sense of order and purpose that he had not experienced since his childhood, and for a time, it seemed as though military service might be a positive experience for him. However, Dean's attitude toward military service was complicated by his continued attachment to the family business and his desire to return to Houston as soon as possible. According to those who knew him during this period, Dean actively disliked military life and made no secret of his desire to return to civilian life. He found the regimentation and hierarchy of military life stifling, and he missed the independence and creativity that had characterized his work in the candy business. It was also during his time in the military that Dean began to explore aspects of his sexuality that he had previously kept hidden. The all-male environment of military service, combined with his separation from family and the familiar surroundings of home, provided him with opportunities to experiment with homosexual relationships for the first time. This was a significant development in Dean's personal life, as it represented the beginning of his recognition and acceptance of his homosexual orientation. The realization that he was homosexual was both liberating and troubling for Dean. On one hand, it provided him with an understanding of feelings and attractions that he had been experiencing but had not fully understood. On the other hand, homosexuality was heavily stigmatized in the 1960s, particularly within the military, and Dean was forced to keep this aspect of his identity secret from his fellow soldiers and his family. Dean's desire to return to civilian life led him to apply for a hardship discharge from the Army. He argued that his mother needed him to help run the family business and that his absence was causing financial difficulties for the family. While such applications were not commonly approved, Dean's case was apparently compelling enough to convince the military authorities that his discharge was warranted. On June 11, 1965, after serving for 10 months, Dean Corll was granted an honorable discharge from the United States Army. This discharge allowed him to return to Houston and resume his role in the family candy business, but it also marked the end of what would prove to be his only extended period away from the Houston area as an adult. Dean's return to Houston in 1965 marked the beginning of the most significant period of his adult life. He was now 26 years old, had completed his military service, and was ready to take on a more significant role in the family business. However, he was also returning as a changed person, someone who had discovered new aspects of his own identity and who had been exposed to experiences and ideas that would shape his future behavior in ways that no one could have predicted. The Houston that Dean returned to in 1965 was also a changing city. The space program was bringing new residents and new industries to the area. The civil rights movement was creating social tensions and opportunities, and the traditional social structures of the South were being challenged and redefined. It was in this context of rapid social change that Dean would spend the next several years of his life, building his role in the family business while secretly exploring the darker aspects of his personality. One of the most significant changes that occurred during Dean's absence was in the structure and ownership of the family candy business. While Dean was serving in the military, his mother, Mary, had divorced her second husband and had taken full control of the company. She had renamed the business the Corll Candy Company, establishing it as a family enterprise that could be passed down to Dean and his brother. When Dean returned from military service, he was appointed as vice president of the newly renamed Corll Candy Company. This promotion represented not only a recognition of his abilities and potential, but also his mother's confidence in his ability to help lead the business into the future. The position came with significant responsibilities, including oversight of production operations, customer relations, and business development activities. The Corll Candy Company was located in Houston Heights, a neighborhood that was known for its family-friendly atmosphere and strong sense of community. The location was ideal for a candy business, as it was easily accessible to families with children and was situated in an area where word-of-mouth advertising could be particularly effective. The neighborhood was also home to Helms Elementary School, which was located directly across the street from the candy factory. Dean's new role as vice president of the company brought him into regular contact with the children and families of the Houston Heights neighborhood. As part of his responsibilities, he often interacted with customers, delivered products, and participated in community events. It was during this period that he began to develop the reputation that would eventually earn him the nickname, the Candy Man. The practice of giving away free candy to local children was something that Dean began doing shortly after his return from military service. This practice served multiple purposes. It was good for business, as it helped to build customer loyalty and attract new customers. It was good for community relations, as it established the Corll Candy Company as a family-friendly business that cared about the local community, and it provided Dean with opportunities to interact with the children of the neighborhood in a way that seemed completely innocent and appropriate. Dean's interactions with the local children were initially viewed very positively by parents and community members. He was seen as a friendly, generous man who took an interest in the welfare of the neighborhood children. Parents appreciated the fact that he would give their children small treats, and the children themselves looked forward to seeing the friendly man from the candy factory who always had something sweet to share with them. However, there were some community members who began to notice that Dean seemed to show a particular interest in young boys. While his interactions with all children were friendly and appropriate on the surface, some observers noted that he seemed to spend more time talking with boys than with girls, and that he seemed particularly drawn to boys who were approaching or had recently entered adolescence. At the time, these observations were dismissed as harmless preferences, but they would later prove to be early warning signs of the darker impulses that Dean was developing. To make his interactions with local children even more appealing, Dean installed a pool table in the back of the candy factory. This created a space where teenage boys could gather after school to play games, socialize, and enjoy the free candy that Dean provided. The pool table quickly became a popular destination for boys in the neighborhood, and Dean enjoyed the role of host and mentor to these young visitors. The pool table also served another purpose that was not immediately apparent to the parents and community members who saw it as a harmless recreational amenity. It provided Dean with a legitimate reason to invite boys to spend time at the candy factory, and it created opportunities for him to develop closer relationships with individual boys who caught his attention. The boys who frequented the pool table began to see Dean as a friend and mentor, someone who treated them with respect and provided them with a place to have fun and socialize. Dean also began taking some of the boys on trips to local beaches and other recreational areas. These outings were presented as innocent fun, opportunities for the boys to enjoy themselves while being supervised by a responsible adult. Parents who knew about these trips generally viewed them positively, seeing Dean as someone who was willing to take an interest in their children's welfare and provide them with positive experiences. However, as time went on, some community members began to notice aspects of Dean's behavior that made them uncomfortable. Several people observed that Dean seemed unusually flirtatious around young men and boys. His interactions with these young people sometimes crossed boundaries that made adults uncomfortable, even though they could not put their finger on exactly what was inappropriate about his behavior. Eventually, some community members began to suspect that Dean might be homosexual. In the conservative social environment of Houston in the 1960s, this suspicion was enough to cause concern among some parents and community members. However, when these concerns were brought to Mary Corll's attention, she refused to believe them and dismissed them as unfounded gossip. The tension between community suspicions and family denial came to a head when a male employee at the candy factory complained to Mary that Dean had made sexual advances toward him. This was the first concrete allegation of inappropriate behavior, and it forced Mary to confront the possibility that the rumors about her son might have some basis in fact. However, rather than investigating the allegations or confronting Dean about his behavior, Mary chose to fire the employee who had made the complaint. This incident was significant because it represented the first documented allegation of inappropriate sexual behavior by Dean Corll. However, the way it was handled, with the victim being punished rather than the alleged perpetrator being investigated, set a pattern that would continue for several more years. The protective attitude of Dean's family, combined with the social stigma associated with homosexuality and sexual abuse during that era, created an environment in which Dean's inappropriate behavior could continue and escalate without being properly addressed. Despite these emerging concerns about Dean's behavior, the Corll Candy Company continued to thrive during the mid-1960s. The business had established a solid reputation in the community, and the family's hard work was paying off in terms of financial success and social standing. From the outside, the Corlls appeared to be a successful family business that was making a positive contribution to their community. However, beneath the surface of this apparent success, Dean was struggling with internal conflicts and desires that he did not fully understand and could not openly discuss with anyone. His homosexual orientation, which he had first begun to explore during his military service, was something that he had to keep hidden from his family and his community. This secrecy and isolation were contributing to his psychological development in ways that would prove to be dangerous. The late 1960s were a period of significant social and cultural change in American society, and these changes were having an impact on Dean's understanding of himself and his place in the world. The sexual revolution was beginning to challenge traditional attitudes about sexuality and sexual behavior, but these changes were slow to reach conservative communities like Houston Heights. For someone like Dean, who was struggling with a stigmatized sexual orientation, this period was one of confusion, frustration, and increasing isolation. It was during this period that Dean began to develop the psychological patterns that would eventually lead to his transformation from a socially awkward but apparently harmless man into one of America's most notorious serial killers. The combination of his troubled childhood, his social isolation, his secret sexual orientation, and his growing sense of power and control over the young people who visited his candy factory was creating a dangerous psychological dynamic. As the 1960s drew to a close, Dean Corll was approaching a crucial turning point in his life. He was nearly 30 years old, had established himself as a successful businessman in his community, and had developed a reputation as someone who cared about the welfare of local children. However, he was also struggling with internal conflicts and desires that were becoming increasingly difficult to control. The stage was being set for the transformation that would turn the friendly candy man into one of the most feared serial killers in American history. As Dean Corll approached his 30th birthday in December 1969, those who knew him began to notice significant changes in his personality and behavior. The friendly, somewhat shy man who had returned from military service just a few years earlier was becoming someone different, more confident in some ways, but also more secretive and unpredictable. This transformation, which would prove to be the beginning of his descent into serial murder, coincided with what many criminal psychologists consider to be a critical age for the development of violent criminal behavior. The late 1960s had been a period of relative stability for Dean, during which he had established himself in the family business and developed his reputation in the community. However, as he entered his 30s, the internal pressures and conflicts that had been building throughout his adult life began to manifest themselves in increasingly troubling ways. The secret aspects of his personality that he had been suppressing were beginning to demand expression, and Dean was finding it increasingly difficult to maintain the facade of normalcy that had protected him for so many years. One of the most significant developments during this period was Dean's growing confidence in his ability to manipulate and control other people, particularly young men and boys. His experiences as vice president of the candy company had given him opportunities to practice these skills in what appeared to be harmless contexts, but he was beginning to recognize the extent of his power over vulnerable young people and to explore ways of using that power for his own gratification. Dean's reputation as the friendly candy man had given him access to numerous young people in the Houston Heights community, and he had learned how to use his position and resources to gain their trust and friendship. He understood that his gifts of candy, his willingness to provide a place for them to socialize, and his apparent interest in their welfare made him attractive to young people who may not have received much positive attention from other adults in their lives. It was during this period that Dean began to systematically identify and cultivate relationships with young people who appeared to be particularly vulnerable to his influence. He developed an ability to recognize boys who came from troubled homes, who had difficult relationships with their parents, who were struggling financially, or who were otherwise isolated or marginalized within their communities. These young people became his primary targets for the grooming process that would eventually lead to their victimization. The year 1970 marked a crucial turning point in Dean Corll's life, as it was during this year that he would commit his first known murder and begin the killing spree that would eventually claim the lives of at least 28 young men and boys. However, the events that led to this first murder did not happen suddenly or without warning. They were the culmination of a gradual process of psychological deterioration and moral corruption that had been developing for several years. One of the most significant events of 1970 was Dean's meeting with David Owen Brooks, a 12-year-old boy who would become his first accomplice in the crimes that were to follow. Brooks was a student at Helms Elementary School, which was located directly across the street from the Corll Candy Company, and he was one of the many local children who regularly received free candy from Dean. David Brooks came from a family that was struggling with its own problems, and he was attracted to the stability and generosity that Dean appeared to offer. Unlike many of the other children who visited the candy factory, Brooks began to spend increasing amounts of time there, and Dean began to take a special interest in him. What began as a typical interaction between Dean and a local child gradually developed into something much more significant and ultimately much more dangerous. Dean's relationship with David Brooks followed a pattern that would later be recognized as a classic example of the grooming process used by predators to prepare their victims for abuse. Initially, Dean simply provided Brooks with candy and small gifts, establishing himself as someone who was generous and caring. He then began to invite Brooks to spend more time at the candy factory, eventually allowing him to treat the place as a second home. As Brooks became more comfortable in Dean's presence and more dependent on the benefits that Dean provided, Dean began to introduce increasingly inappropriate elements into their relationship. He started making sexual jokes and comments, exposing Brooks to pornographic materials, and gradually normalizing the idea of sexual activity between males. This process was so gradual that Brooks did not recognize what was happening until he was already deeply involved in the relationship. By 1969, Dean had succeeded in establishing a sexual relationship with David Brooks, who was by then around 14 years old. According to Brooks's later testimony, Dean would pay him cash sums of up to $10 or provide him with gifts, such as blacklight posters, in exchange for sexual favors. While $10 may not seem like a significant amount of money by today's standards, it represented a substantial sum for a teenage boy in 1970, particularly one from a family with limited financial resources. The sexual relationship between Dean and Brooks was significant not only because it represented Dean's first known sexual victimization of a minor, but also because it established a pattern of using money and gifts to obtain sexual compliance from vulnerable young people. This pattern would become central to Dean's later crimes, as he would use similar techniques to recruit and control both victims and accomplices. Brooks's involvement with Dean also marked the beginning of Dean's transformation from someone who simply abused individual victims to someone who would eventually orchestrate a complex criminal operation involving multiple accomplices and numerous victims. The relationship with Brooks taught Dean valuable lessons about how to identify, groom, and control vulnerable young people, lessons that he would later apply on a much larger and more deadly scale. As 1970 progressed, Dean's behavior became increasingly bold and increasingly dangerous. The success of his grooming and abuse of David Brooks had given him confidence in his ability to manipulate young people, and he began to look for opportunities to expand his activities. He also began to develop the infrastructure and techniques that would later enable him to commit murder and dispose of bodies without being detected. One of the most significant developments during this period was Dean's decision to begin varying his living arrangements more frequently than he had in the past. Whereas he had previously maintained relatively stable housing situations, he now began to move from one apartment or house to another on a regular basis. This pattern of frequent moves served several purposes. It made it more difficult for anyone to monitor his activities closely. It provided him with multiple locations where he could bring victims without arousing suspicion, and it helped to ensure that any suspicious activities at one location would not be connected to him personally. Dean's frequent changes of address also reflected his growing paranoia and his recognition that his activities were becoming increasingly risky. He understood that what he was doing was illegal and that discovery could result in serious criminal charges, loss of his business, and complete social disgrace. The frequent moves were one way of managing these risks, while still pursuing the activities that were becoming increasingly important to his psychological well-being. Another significant development during this period was Dean's growing sophistication in his understanding of how to avoid detection by law enforcement and other authorities. He began to study the techniques used by other criminals, he learned about police investigation methods, and he developed strategies for minimizing the evidence that his crimes would leave behind. This knowledge would prove to be crucial in enabling him to continue his activities for several years without being caught. Dean also began to develop the specific techniques and equipment that he would later use to torture and murder his victims. He acquired handcuffs, rope, and other restraining devices. He purchased tools that could be used to inflict pain and suffering, and he began to experiment with different methods of killing that would be both effective and relatively quiet. This preparation was methodical and deliberate, reflecting Dean's transformation from someone who acted on impulse to someone who carefully planned and executed his crimes. The first half of 1970 was a period of preparation and escalation for Dean Corll. He was using his relationship with David Brooks to refine his techniques for manipulating and controlling young people. He was developing the infrastructure and knowledge necessary to commit serious crimes, and he was gradually working up the courage to cross the line from sexual abuse to murder. All of these developments were leading toward a moment that would change everything: the commission of his first murder. On September 25, 1970, Dean Corll crossed that line when he murdered Jeffrey Allen Conan, an 18-year-old college freshman from the University of Texas. Conan's murder marked the beginning of what would become known as the Houston mass murders, one of the most extensive and horrific serial killing sprees in American history. Jeffrey Conan was not someone who fit the typical profile of Dean's previous victims. Unlike the troubled young boys from the Houston Heights neighborhood who had been the focus of Dean's attention, Conan was a college student from a stable family who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been hitchhiking with a fellow student from Austin to his parents' home in Houston when the two were separated, leaving Conan alone and vulnerable to Dean's predatory behavior. The circumstances of Conan's abduction illustrate how Dean had evolved from someone who primarily targeted victims from his immediate social circle to someone who was actively hunting for victims among the general population. Conan was picked up by a fellow student near Bergstrom Air Force Base at 3:30 in the afternoon and was dropped off at the corner of Westheimer Road and South Voss Road in the uptown area of Houston at approximately 6:30 in the evening. It was at this location that he encountered Dean Corll, who offered him a ride to his destination. What happened next represents the first known example of the pattern that Dean would follow in virtually all of his subsequent murders. He lured Conan to his apartment with the promise of help or companionship. He then restrained and tortured his victim over a period of time, and he finally killed the victim and disposed of the body in a location where it was unlikely to be discovered quickly. This pattern would become Dean's signature method of operation, and it would enable him to kill dozens of victims over the next 3 years. Conan's murder was particularly significant because it demonstrated that Dean had developed the psychological capacity to kill another human being. This represented a fundamental transformation in his character, as he moved from someone who was content to abuse and manipulate his victims to someone who was willing to take their lives. This crossing of the line from abuse to murder marked the beginning of a new and far more dangerous phase in Dean's criminal career. The disposal of Conan's body also marked the beginning of Dean's systematic approach to hiding the evidence of his crimes. Rather than simply leaving the body where it might be quickly discovered, Dean transported it to High Island Beach, where he buried it beneath a large boulder, covered it with lime, wrapped it in plastic, and bound it with nylon cord. This elaborate disposal method reflects the planning and forethought that Dean had put into preparing for his crimes, and it demonstrates his understanding of the need to prevent the discovery of evidence that could link him to the murder. The successful murder and disposal of Jeffrey Conan's body represented a psychological milestone for Dean Corll. He had proven to himself that he could kill another human being and avoid immediate detection, and this success gave him the confidence to continue and escalate his criminal activities. The murder also provided him with a sense of power and control that he had never experienced before, and this feeling became addictive, driving him to seek out additional victims. However, the murder of Jeffrey Conan also marked the beginning of a new level of psychological stress and paranoia for Dean. Despite his careful planning and execution, he was aware that he had committed an act that could result in life imprisonment or even execution if he were caught. This knowledge created a constant state of anxiety that would influence all of his subsequent decisions and behavior. In the weeks and months following Conan's murder, Dean began to develop the support system and infrastructure that would enable him to continue killing on a larger scale. He recognized that operating alone was both more difficult and more risky than working with accomplices who could help him identify victims, assist in their abduction and murder, and help dispose of the evidence. This recognition led him to begin the process of recruiting David Brooks as an active accomplice rather than simply a victim. The recruitment of Brooks as an accomplice represented another significant milestone in Dean's criminal development. By convincing Brooks to participate in his crimes, Dean was able to expand his capabilities while also ensuring Brooks's silence through complicity. This arrangement provided Dean with the assistance he needed while creating a situation in which Brooks could not report Dean's crimes without implicating himself. The process of converting Brooks from victim to accomplice was gradual and carefully managed. Dean began by involving Brooks in relatively minor criminal activities, such as theft and vandalism, gradually escalating to more serious crimes as Brooks became more deeply involved and more psychologically committed to the relationship. This process ensured that Brooks would be psychologically prepared to participate in murder when the time came. Dean also began to develop the story that he would use to justify his crimes to his accomplices and to encourage their participation. He told Brooks and later Henley that the young men they were abducting were being sold to a mysterious organization in Dallas that was involved in prostitution and other illegal activities. This story served multiple purposes. It provided a rationale for the abductions that seemed less morally objectionable than murder. It suggested that the victims would continue to live after being turned over to Dean, and it implied that Dean was part of a larger criminal organization that could protect them if they remained loyal. The development of this cover story was psychologically important for Dean because it allowed him to maintain some degree of self-deception about the true nature of his crimes. By telling himself and his accomplices that the victims were being sold rather than murdered, Dean could avoid fully confronting the reality of what he was doing and could maintain some semblance of moral justification for his actions. As 1970 drew to a close, Dean Corll had successfully committed his first murder and had begun the process of developing the criminal organization that would enable him to continue killing for the next 3 years. He had proven to himself that he could kill without being caught. He had begun to recruit accomplices who would assist him in future crimes, and he had developed the psychological justifications that would allow him to continue escalating his criminal behavior. The transformation of Dean Corll from the friendly candy man to a serial killer was now complete. The groundwork had been laid for what would become one of the most extensive and horrific series of murders in American criminal history. The stage was set for the killing spree that would terrorize Houston for the next 3 years and would ultimately claim the lives of at least 28 young men and boys. As 1971 began, Dean Corll had already crossed the most significant psychological barrier that separates criminals from killers. He had taken a human life and had successfully avoided detection. The murder of Jeffrey Conan in September 1970 had proven to Dean that he could kill and dispose of bodies without being caught, and this knowledge gave him the confidence to begin the systematic killing spree that would define the final years of his life. The success of the Conan murder had also taught Dean important lessons about victim selection, crime scene management, and body disposal that would influence all of his subsequent crimes. He had learned that college students and other transient young people made ideal victims because their disappearances were less likely to trigger immediate police investigations. He had discovered that careful planning and preparation were essential for avoiding detection, and he had proven that remote burial sites could effectively conceal evidence for extended periods of time. However, Dean's experiences with the Conan murder had also revealed some of the limitations and risks associated with operating alone. The process of abducting, restraining, torturing, killing, and disposing of a victim was physically demanding and logistically complex, particularly for someone who needed to maintain the appearance of leading a normal life. Dean recognized that he would need assistance if he wanted to continue and escalate his criminal activities. This recognition led Dean to begin the process of converting David Brooks from a victim of sexual abuse into an active accomplice in murder. This transformation was accomplished gradually through a carefully managed process of psychological manipulation and escalating criminal involvement that would serve as a model for Dean's later recruitment of Elmer Wayne Henley. The process began with Dean involving Brooks in relatively minor criminal activities that were unrelated to murder. He encouraged Brooks to help him steal items from stores and homes, to participate in acts of vandalism, and to engage in other petty crimes that helped to establish a pattern of shared criminal activity. These initial crimes served multiple purposes. They tested Brooks's willingness to break the law. They created a sense of partnership and shared risk between Dean and Brooks, and they began the process of normalizing criminal behavior in Brooks's mind. As Brooks became more comfortable with this level of criminal activity, Dean began to introduce him to more serious crimes and to share more information about his ultimate intentions. He began to tell Brooks stories about young men who had supposedly been sold to organizations in Dallas for use in prostitution and other illegal activities. These stories were designed to prepare Brooks psychologically for his eventual participation in abductions while providing him with a rationalization that made such participation seem less morally objectionable. Dean also began to show Brooks some of the equipment and facilities that he had prepared for use in his crimes. He introduced Brooks to the restraints, tools, and other devices that he planned to use on victims, presenting them as necessary tools for subduing young men who needed to be transported to Dallas. This exposure served to further normalize the idea of restraining and controlling victims while also testing Brooks's reactions to the more disturbing aspects of Dean's plans. The gradual nature of this recruitment process was crucial to its success. By slowly escalating the level of criminal activity and psychological manipulation, Dean was able to draw Brooks deeper into his criminal world without triggering the kind of shock or resistance that might have occurred if Brooks had been confronted with the full reality of Dean's intentions all at once. Each step in the process seemed like a relatively small progression from what had come before, making it psychologically easier for Brooks to continue his involvement. By early 1971, Dean felt confident that Brooks was sufficiently committed to their relationship and sufficiently implicated in criminal activity to be trusted with knowledge of his murder plans. He began to discuss with Brooks the possibility of abducting young men from the Houston Heights area, presenting these abductions as business transactions that would provide both of them with significant financial benefits. Dean told Brooks that he could earn $200 for each young man that he helped to deliver to the mysterious Dallas organization. For a teenager from a working-class family in 1971, $200 represented a substantial sum of money, equivalent to several weeks' wages from a typical part-time job. This financial incentive was crucial in securing Brooks's cooperation, as it provided him with a concrete, immediate benefit that helped to overcome any moral reservations he might have had about participating in the abductions. The first known murder in which Brooks participated occurred in December 1970, just a few months after Dean's murder of Jeffrey Conan. The victims were two young men named James Glass and Danny Yates, both of whom were familiar to Brooks from the Houston Heights neighborhood. The selection of these particular victims was significant because it demonstrated Dean's shift from targeting random strangers to targeting young people from his immediate social environment. The murders of Glass and Yates established the pattern that Dean would follow for most of his subsequent crimes. The victims were lured to Dean's apartment with promises of parties, drugs, or other inducements that were appealing to young people from their background. Once they were inside Dean's apartment, they were restrained using handcuffs and rope, then subjected to hours or days of torture and sexual abuse before being killed. Their bodies were then wrapped in plastic, treated with lime to accelerate decomposition and reduce odors, and buried in locations where they were unlikely to be discovered. The participation of Brooks in these murders marked a significant escalation in Dean's criminal capabilities. With Brooks's assistance, Dean could more easily identify and approach potential victims, particularly those who might be suspicious of advances from an adult stranger. Brooks could also help to restrain victims during the abduction process and could assist with the physical demands of torture, murder, and body disposal. Perhaps most importantly, Brooks's participation created a relationship of mutual complicity that ensured his continued silence about Dean's crimes. The psychological impact of participating in these first murders was profound for both Dean and Brooks, though in different ways. For Dean, the successful completion of multiple murders with Brooks's assistance represented validation of his evolving criminal methodology and confirmation of his ability to recruit and control accomplices. The experience gave him confidence to continue and expand his activities, and it reinforced his belief that he could continue to avoid detection by law enforcement. For Brooks, the experience of participating in murder represented a psychological point of no return that would forever change his understanding of himself and his place in the world. The act of taking human life, even as an accomplice rather than the primary perpetrator, created a level of moral compromise that made it increasingly difficult for him to extract himself from his relationship with Dean. The knowledge of what he had done and the fear of the consequences if his actions were discovered created a psychological trap that Dean would use to ensure Brooks's continued cooperation. As 1971 progressed, Dean and Brooks settled into a routine of identifying, abducting, torturing, and murdering young men from the Houston Heights area. The frequency of these murders increased gradually throughout the year, as Dean became more confident in his methods and more addicted to the sense of power and control that the crimes provided him. The murders also became more elaborate and prolonged, as Dean developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for inflicting pain and psychological torment on his victims. One of the most significant developments during this period was Dean's construction of what would later be described as a torture board, a piece of marine-grade plywood that could be hung on a wall or laid flat, equipped with restraints and other devices designed to hold victims in positions that facilitated torture and sexual abuse. This torture board became central to Dean's methodology, and its construction represented a significant investment of time and planning that demonstrated his commitment to continuing and escalating his criminal activities. The torture board was designed to allow Dean to restrain victims in a variety of positions while having easy access to all parts of their bodies. It was equipped with handcuffs, ropes, and other restraining devices that could hold victims securely, while still allowing Dean to move them into different positions as needed. The board was also designed to be easily cleaned and to minimize the amount of physical evidence that would be left behind after a victim was tortured and killed. The use of the torture board also reflected Dean's evolving psychological needs and desires. The prolonged torture sessions that the board facilitated were not simply a means to an end, but had become an important source of psychological gratification for Dean. He derived pleasure not only from the sexual abuse of his victims, but also from their fear, pain, and psychological suffering. The torture board allowed him to maximize and extend these experiences, satisfying his growing appetite for inflicting suffering on others. During the spring of 1971, Dean committed what would prove to be some of his most psychologically significant murders. Between March and May of that year, he abducted and killed 3 victims who would later be found buried in his boat storage shed: Randall Harvey, David Hilligiest, and Gregory Malley-Winkle. These murders were significant not only because of their impact on the victims and their families, but also because they would eventually lead to Dean's recruitment of his second major accomplice, Elmer Wayne Henley. Randall Harvey was a 15-year-old boy who worked part-time at a gas station in Oak Forest. He was last seen by his family on the afternoon of March 9, 1971, as he cycled toward his workplace. Harvey was apparently abducted by Dean and Brooks during his commute, taken to Dean's apartment on Mangum Road, and killed by a single gunshot to the head. His body was then transported to the boat storage shed that Dean had rented in southwest Houston, where it was buried beneath the floor. The murders of David Hillegiest and Gregory Malley Winkle occurred together on the afternoon of May 29, 1971. Hillegiest was a 13-year-old boy who lived in the Houston Heights area, while Winkle was a 16-year-old who had previously worked at the Corll Candy Company. The fact that one of the victims was a former employee of Dean's family business demonstrated his willingness to target individuals from his immediate social and professional circle, a development that significantly increased the risk of his criminal activities being discovered. The disappearance of David Hillegiest had a profound impact on the Houston Heights community, as he was a well-known and well-liked boy whose absence was immediately noticed by family, friends, and neighbors. His parents launched an intensive search effort, printing posters offering a monetary reward for information about their son's whereabouts and distributing them throughout the neighborhood. One of the young people who volunteered to help distribute these posters was 15-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley, a lifelong friend of David Hillegiest who would later become Dean's second major accomplice. Henley's involvement in the search for his missing friend represents one of the most disturbing aspects of Dean's crimes: the way in which he was able to manipulate people who cared about his victims into becoming unwitting participants in covering up his crimes. Henley's willingness to help search for his missing friend was motivated by genuine concern and affection for Hillegiest, but it also brought him to Dean's attention as a potential recruit. Dean observed Henley's dedication to the search effort, his obvious distress over his friend's disappearance, and his apparent need for guidance and support during this difficult time. These observations led Dean to identify Henley as someone who might be vulnerable to the same kind of manipulation and recruitment that had been successful with David Brooks. The process of recruiting Henley began gradually, with Dean and Brooks approaching him at the gas station where he worked part-time. Initially, these contacts were presented as casual social interactions, with Dean and Brooks simply stopping by to chat and offering friendship and support to a young man who was obviously troubled by his friend's disappearance. However, these interactions were actually the beginning of a carefully planned recruitment process that would eventually lead to Henley's participation in multiple murders. Dean's approach to recruiting Henley was similar to the method he had used with Brooks, but it was refined based on the lessons he had learned from his earlier experience. He began by establishing himself as a generous and caring adult who was interested in Henley's welfare and willing to provide him with benefits that he could not obtain elsewhere. He offered Henley money, gifts, and social opportunities that were appealing to a teenager from a working-class family with limited resources. Dean also took advantage of Henley's obvious need for male guidance and support. Henley came from a troubled family background, with an absent father and a mother who was struggling to raise several children on her own. Dean positioned himself as a father figure who could provide the guidance, support, and validation that Henley was not receiving at home. This psychological manipulation was particularly effective because it appealed to fundamental emotional needs that Henley had developed during his difficult childhood. The recruitment of Henley was also facilitated by his existing friendship with David Brooks. Brooks served as an intermediary who could vouch for Dean's character and introduce Henley to the benefits of being part of Dean's inner circle. Brooks's apparent success and happiness with the arrangement made it seem attractive to Henley, who was looking for ways to improve his own circumstances. By October 1971, Dean felt confident enough in his relationship with Henley to make him the same offer that he had made to Brooks, $200 for each young man that he could help deliver to the supposed Dallas organization. Initially, Henley was suspicious of this offer and declined to participate, sensing that there was something not quite right about the proposition. However, Dean was patient and continued to work on building the relationship and addressing Henley's concerns. The turning point in Henley's recruitment came in early 1972, when his family experienced financial difficulties that made Dean's monetary offers more attractive. Faced with genuine need and continued pressure from Dean and Brooks, Henley finally agreed to participate in what he believed were abductions of young men who would be sold to organizations in Dallas. Like Brooks before him, Henley was not initially told that the young men were actually being murdered, and he was provided with rationalization that made his participation seem less morally objectionable. The recruitment of Henley represented a significant expansion of Dean's criminal capabilities, as he now had two accomplices who could help him identify victims, assist in abductions, and participate in the various aspects of his crimes. This expansion also marked the beginning of the most intensive and deadly period of Dean's criminal career, during which he would murder more victims in a shorter period of time than ever before. However, the addition of Henley to Dean's criminal organization also introduced new risks and complications that would eventually contribute to Dean's downfall. Unlike Brooks, who had been groomed from a very young age and who had a more dependent relationship with Dean, Henley retained more independence and was more likely to question Dean's decisions and methods. This independence would eventually lead to conflicts between Henley and Dean that would prove to be fatal for Dean. As 1971 drew to a close, Dean Corll had successfully established a criminal organization that was capable of identifying, abducting, torturing, and murdering victims on a regular basis. He had recruited two accomplices who were psychologically committed to the enterprise and who had already participated in multiple murders. He had developed sophisticated methods for avoiding detection by law enforcement and for disposing of evidence. And he had established a pattern of victim selection and crime scene management that allowed him to operate with relative impunity. The stage was now set for the most intensive period of Dean's killing spree, during which he would murder more victims than ever before and would establish himself as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. However, the same factors that enabled this escalation would also create the conditions that would eventually lead to his discovery and death. The psychological dynamics that had allowed him to recruit and control his accomplices would eventually turn against him, and the very success of his criminal enterprise would create the circumstances that would bring about its destruction. The year 1972 marked the most intensive and horrific period of Dean Corll's killing spree, during which he and his accomplices would murder more victims than in any other single year of their criminal partnership. By this time, Dean had refined his methods to a terrifying degree of efficiency, and his two teenage accomplices, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, had become fully integrated into his criminal operations. The psychological dynamics that governed their relationship had evolved into a deadly machine that could identify, capture, torture, and kill victims with ruthless regularity. The success of Dean's criminal enterprise during 1972 was facilitated by several factors that had developed over the previous 2 years. His recruitment of Henley as a second accomplice had doubled his capacity for identifying and approaching potential victims, particularly among the teenage population of Houston Heights. His refinement of torture and killing techniques had made the murder process more efficient and psychologically satisfying for him, and his development of sophisticated body disposal methods had enabled him to avoid detection despite the increasing number of victims. However, the year 1972 also marked the beginning of changes in Dean's psychological state that would eventually lead to his downfall. The prolonged period of killing and torture was having a cumulative effect on his mental stability, making him more paranoid, more erratic, and more difficult for his accomplices to predict and control. The addictive nature of the power and control that he derived from his crimes was driving him to take increasingly dangerous risks and to demand more from his accomplices than they were psychologically prepared to provide. One of the most significant developments during this period was the evolution of Dean's relationship with his accomplices from one of manipulation and control to one of increasing mutual dependence and psychological complexity. While Dean remained the dominant figure in the group, Brooks and Henley had become more than simply tools for implementing his criminal plans. They had developed their own psychological investment in the crimes, their own methods for rationalizing their participation, and their own sources of satisfaction from the power and control that their roles provided them. This evolution in the group dynamics was both a source of strength and a source of vulnerability for Dean's criminal enterprise. On one hand, the deeper psychological investment of his accomplices made them more reliable partners who were less likely to abandon the enterprise or to cooperate with law enforcement if they were discovered. On the other hand, their growing independence and confidence made them more likely to challenge Dean's decisions and to pursue their own agendas within the criminal organization. The murders committed during 1972 were characterized by increasing levels of violence, more elaborate torture procedures, and longer periods of captivity for victims. Dean had developed an extensive collection of torture devices and had refined his techniques for inflicting maximum pain and psychological trauma on his victims. The marine-grade plywood torture board that he had constructed had been supplemented with additional restraints, tools, and devices that allowed him to subject victims to unimaginable suffering over periods that sometimes extended for several days. One of the most disturbing aspects of the 1972 murders was the increasing involvement of Brooks and Henley in the actual torture and killing of victims. While they had initially served primarily as recruiters and assistants, they had gradually taken on more active roles in the violence itself. This escalation was partially the result of Dean's deliberate efforts to implicate them more deeply in the crimes, making it impossible for them to claim ignorance or limited involvement if they were ever questioned by authorities. The psychological transformation of Brooks and Henley from reluctant accomplices to active participants in torture and murder represents one of the most chilling aspects of the entire case. Both young men had begun their involvement with Dean as victims of his manipulation and abuse, but the prolonged exposure to violence and the gradual process of psychological corruption had transformed them into killers in their own right. This transformation demonstrates the power of environmental factors and peer influence in shaping human behavior, even in situations involving the most extreme forms of violence. Henley, in particular, showed a disturbing aptitude for violence that surprised even Dean. According to later testimony from Brooks, Henley was especially sadistic in his participation in the murders and seemed to derive particular satisfaction from the suffering of victims. Henley himself later admitted to becoming fascinated with how much stamina people have when subjected to torture and murder, indicating that he had developed his own psychological investment in the violence that went beyond simply following Dean's instructions. The increasing sophistication and intensity of the torture procedures also reflected Dean's growing appetite for psychological and physical domination of his victims. The simple murders of his early crimes had evolved into elaborate rituals of suffering that could extend for days before the victim was finally killed. These extended torture sessions served multiple psychological functions for Dean. They satisfied his need for control and domination. They provided him with sexual gratification, and they served as a form of psychological release for the tensions and frustrations that had been building throughout his life. One of the most horrific examples of these extended torture sessions occurred in 1972 with the murder of Billy Gene Balch Jr., a 17-year-old former employee of the Corll Candy Company. Balch was considered one of Dean's favorite victims, which meant that he was subjected to an extended period of captivity and torture that lasted approximately 3 days. During this time, he was restrained on the torture board in Dean's bedroom, given minimal food and water, and subjected to continuous sexual abuse and physical torture. The psychological cruelty of Balch's murder was compounded by Dean's decision to force him to write a letter to his parents claiming that he was leaving for a job opportunity and asking them not to worry about him. This letter was designed to prevent Balch's parents from reporting him as missing and to delay any investigation into his disappearance. The forced writing of this letter represents a particularly sadistic aspect of Dean's crimes, as it required the victim to participate in covering up his own murder while providing false reassurance to the family members who loved him. The disposal of Balch's body also reflected the increasingly elaborate methods that Dean was using to conceal evidence of his crimes. After 3 days of torture, Balch was finally strangled to death by Henley, with the process reportedly taking almost 30 minutes to complete. His body was then transported to Lake Sam Rayburn, where Dean's family owned a lakeside cabin, and buried in a remote location that was unlikely to be discovered by casual visitors or law enforcement personnel. The selection of Lake Sam Rayburn as a burial site demonstrated Dean's strategic thinking about body disposal and his understanding of the need to spread evidence across multiple locations to reduce the risk of discovery. The lake location was particularly attractive because it was remote, because Dean had legitimate reasons for visiting the area, and because the soft soil near the water would make digging graves easier and faster. Another significant murder during 1972 was that of Johnny DeLome, who was killed along with Billy Balch in what represents one of the most disturbing examples of Dean's capacity for psychological manipulation and cruelty. According to Henley's later testimony, both victims were initially socializing voluntarily with Dean and Brooks at Dean's apartment, apparently unaware of the danger they were in until it was too late to escape. The murder of Delhomme was particularly disturbing because of the psychological games that Dean played with the victim before killing him. After Balch had been strangled, Dean had Henley call out, "Hey, Johnny," to get Delhomme's attention, then shot him in the forehead with a bullet exiting through his ear. The wounded but still conscious Delhomme then pleaded with Henley, saying, "Wayne, please don't," before he was finally strangled to death. This sequence of events illustrates several important aspects of Dean's psychological profile and criminal methodology. The decision to kill the victims in front of each other was designed to maximize the psychological trauma experienced by both victims, satisfying Dean's need to inflict suffering beyond the purely physical. The involvement of Henley in calling out to Delhomme before shooting him was designed to implicate Henley more deeply in the murder, while also testing his willingness to participate in the psychological torture of victims. And the victim's plea to Henley by name demonstrates how Dean's accomplices had become known to potential victims, making them trusted figures who could be used to facilitate abductions and murders. The increasing frequency and intensity of murders during 1972 also reflected changes in Dean's living situation and criminal infrastructure that made his activities both more convenient and more dangerous. During this period, Dean moved several times, always seeking living arrangements that would facilitate his crimes while minimizing the risk of detection. He consistently chose locations that offered privacy, soundproofing, and easy access for transporting victims and disposing of bodies. One of the most significant developments during this period was Dean's rental of a boat storage shed in southwest Houston that would eventually become the primary burial site for his victims. This storage facility provided Dean with a secure location where he could bury bodies without fear of discovery by casual observers, and it offered the additional advantage of being a place where Dean had legitimate reasons for visiting on a regular basis. The boat shed burial site represents one of the most chilling aspects of Dean's crimes, as it demonstrates the methodical and businesslike approach that he took to disposing of evidence. The shed contained a soft, shell-crushed earth floor that made digging graves relatively easy, and Dean had arranged the space to accommodate multiple burials while maintaining an appearance of legitimate storage use. The systematic nature of the burials, with bodies carefully wrapped in plastic and treated with lime to accelerate decomposition, reflects the level of planning and organization that Dean brought to every aspect of his criminal enterprise. The psychological impact of maintaining this burial site was significant for all three members of Dean's criminal organization. For Dean, the shed represented a tangible symbol of his power and success as a killer, a place where he could visit his victims and remember the satisfaction that their murders had provided him. For Brooks and Henley, the shed represented the physical evidence of their complicity in multiple murders, making it impossible for them to deny their involvement or to distance themselves psychologically from the reality of what they had done. As 1972 progressed, the psychological strain of maintaining their criminal activities was beginning to affect all three members of Dean's organization in different ways. Dean was becoming increasingly paranoid and erratic, demanding more from his accomplices while providing them with less guidance and support. Brooks was struggling with the psychological burden of his complicity in multiple murders and was beginning to show signs of the mental health problems that would plague him for the rest of his life. And Henley was developing his own appetite for violence and control that was beginning to conflict with his subordinate role in the organization. These psychological tensions were compounded by practical challenges that were making their criminal activities increasingly difficult to maintain. The increasing number of missing young men in the Houston Heights area was beginning to attract attention from parents, community members, and eventually law enforcement officials. While individual disappearances had initially been dismissed as runaways or other non-criminal explanations, the pattern of missing persons was becoming difficult to ignore. The families of missing victims were also becoming more organized and persistent in their efforts to find their children and to demand action from law enforcement. Parents were forming support groups, sharing information about their missing children, and putting pressure on police departments to investigate the disappearances more thoroughly. This increased attention made it more difficult for Dean and his accomplices to operate with the same level of impunity that they had enjoyed during the early stages of their criminal careers. Despite these mounting pressures, Dean was unable or unwilling to reduce the frequency of his crimes. The psychological addiction to killing and torture had become so strong that he was willing to accept increasingly dangerous levels of risk in order to continue satisfying his needs. This inability to moderate his behavior in response to changing circumstances would eventually prove to be his downfall, as it led him to take risks that ultimately resulted in his death and the discovery of his crimes. The year 1972 also saw the introduction of new torture techniques and methods that reflected Dean's growing sophistication as a killer and his increasing appetite for inflicting suffering on his victims. The torture board that had been the centerpiece of his early crimes had been supplemented with additional devices and techniques that allowed him to subject victims to new forms of physical and psychological torment. These methods included the use of glass rods inserted into victims' sexual organs, the systematic removal of pubic hair, and various forms of sexual mutilation that were designed to maximize pain and humiliation. The development of these increasingly elaborate torture methods reflects several important aspects of Dean's psychological evolution during this period. The sexual nature of much of the torture indicates that Dean's crimes were driven at least in part by sexual sadism and a need to dominate and humiliate his victims in the most intimate ways possible. The increasing sophistication of the techniques suggests that Dean was learning from each murder and constantly seeking new ways to enhance his own psychological satisfaction from the crimes. And the extreme nature of the torture indicates that Dean's capacity for empathy and human connection had been completely destroyed by his prolonged engagement in violent criminal behavior. The participation of Brooks and Henley in these torture sessions was also evolving during 1972, as they became more actively involved in the actual infliction of suffering rather than simply serving as assistants or witnesses. This evolution reflects their own psychological transformation from reluctant accomplices to active participants in sadistic violence. The fact that both young men were able to participate in such extreme forms of torture demonstrates the power of environmental factors and peer pressure in shaping human behavior, even in situations involving the most extreme violations of basic human dignity. As 1972 drew to a close, Dean Corll and his accomplices had established themselves as one of the most prolific and sadistic killing teams in American criminal history. They had murdered more victims in a single year than most serial killers kill in their entire careers, and they had developed methods of torture and body disposal that allowed them to avoid detection despite the increasing attention their activities were receiving from law enforcement and the community. However, the very success of their criminal enterprise was creating conditions that would eventually lead to its destruction. The psychological strain of maintaining such an intensive level of violent criminal activity was affecting all three participants in ways that were making them less stable and less predictable. The mounting evidence of their crimes was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal, and the growing attention from law enforcement and the community was making continued operations increasingly risky. Most importantly, the psychological dynamics that had allowed Dean to recruit and control his accomplices were beginning to change in ways that threatened his position as the dominant figure in the organization. Both Brooks and Henley had developed their own psychological investment in the crimes and their own sources of satisfaction from the violence, making them less dependent on Dean's approval and guidance. This evolution in the group dynamics would eventually create the conditions that would lead to Dean's death and the end of the Houston mass murders. The stage was now set for the final act of this horrific drama, during which the psychological tensions that had been building within Dean's criminal organization would finally explode into open conflict, leading to Dean's death and the discovery of one of the most extensive and horrific series of murders in American history. As 1973 began, Dean Corll was operating at the peak of his power as a serial killer, but the psychological and practical pressures that had been building throughout his criminal career were approaching a breaking point. The previous year had seen an unprecedented level of killing activity, with Dean and his accomplices murdering more victims than ever before and refining their techniques to a terrifying degree of efficiency. However, this success was coming at a cost that would ultimately prove to be unsustainable. The intensive killing schedule of 1972 had taken a significant psychological toll on all three members of Dean's criminal organization. Dean himself was showing increasing signs of paranoia erratic behavior, and loss of emotional control that made him more unpredictable and more difficult for his accomplices to manage. The constant stress of maintaining their criminal activities while appearing to live normal lives was wearing down their psychological defenses and making it increasingly difficult for them to function effectively as a team. Brooks was struggling with the cumulative psychological impact of participating in dozens of murders over a period of more than 2 years. The young man who had begun as a victim of Dean's sexual abuse had been transformed into an active participant in some of the most horrific crimes in American history, and the weight of this transformation was beginning to affect his mental stability and his relationship with Dean. He was becoming more withdrawn, more unpredictable, and more likely to question Dean's decisions and methods. Henley was experiencing his own psychological evolution that was creating new tensions within the group. Unlike Brooks, who had been gradually drawn into criminal activity over a period of several years, Henley had been introduced to murder relatively quickly and had shown an immediate aptitude for violence that had surprised even Dean. However, this aptitude was also leading Henley to develop his own ideas about how their criminal enterprise should be operated, and these ideas were beginning to conflict with Dean's traditional role as the unquestioned leader of the group. The psychological dynamics that were developing between Dean and his accomplices during early 1973 were further complicated by practical challenges that were making their criminal activities increasingly difficult to maintain. The growing number of missing young men in the Houston Heights area was attracting increasing attention from parents, community members, and law enforcement officials. While individual disappearances had initially been dismissed as runaways or other non-criminal explanations, the pattern was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Local families were becoming more organized in their efforts to find their missing children and to demand action from law enforcement. Parents were sharing information about their missing sons, comparing notes about the circumstances of their disappearances, and putting increasing pressure on police departments to investigate the cases more thoroughly. This growing attention was making it more difficult for Dean and his accomplices to identify and approach potential victims without attracting unwanted attention. The Houston Police Department was also beginning to take notice of the unusual pattern of missing young men in the Heights area, although they had not yet connected the disappearances to a single criminal enterprise. Individual officers were becoming familiar with the cases and were beginning to recognize patterns that suggested something more sinister than a series of unrelated runaways. However, the department's resources were limited, and the investigation of missing persons cases was not considered a high priority compared to other criminal activities. Despite these mounting pressures, Dean was unable to reduce the frequency of his criminal activities or to modify his methods in ways that might reduce the risk of detection. The psychological addiction to killing and torture had become so strong that he was compelled to continue his activities even as the risks became increasingly apparent. This inability to moderate his behavior in response to changing circumstances reflects the extent to which his capacity for rational decision-making had been compromised by his prolonged engagement in violent criminal behavior. The murders committed during the first half of 1973 were characterized by the same level of violence and sadistic torture that had marked Dean's crimes during 1972, but they also showed signs of increasing recklessness and disorganization that suggested Dean's psychological state was deteriorating. The careful planning and methodical execution that had characterized his early crimes were being replaced by more impulsive and less carefully considered actions that increased the risk of detection and capture. One of the most significant murders during this period was that of 13-year-old James Dramela, who was abducted on August 3, 1973, just 5 days before Dean's death. This murder was significant not only because Dramela was the youngest of Dean's known victims, but also because it represented the final expression of Dean's criminal methodology before the dramatic events that would bring his killing spree to an end. The selection of such a young victim reflects the extent to which Dean's appetite for violence and control had escalated beyond any rational boundaries. While his early victims had typically been teenagers or young adults who could at least theoretically be mistaken for willing participants in some kind of consensual activity, the murder of a 13-year-old child represented a clear escalation to purely predatory behavior that could not be rationalized or justified under any circumstances. The murder of James Dramela also occurred at a time when Dean's relationship with his accomplices was becoming increasingly strained and unpredictable. Both Brooks and Henley were showing signs of psychological strain that made them less reliable partners and more likely to challenge Dean's authority or to make mistakes that could expose their criminal activities. The combination combination of Dean's deteriorating mental state and the growing instability of his accomplices was creating a volatile situation that could not be maintained indefinitely. The psychological tensions within Dean's criminal organization were further exacerbated by changes in his personal relationships and living situation during 1973. Dean had moved several times during this period, seeking living arrangements that would facilitate his criminal activities while providing him with the privacy and security he needed to continue operating without detection. However, these frequent moves were also creating logistical challenges and making it more difficult for him to maintain the stable infrastructure that his crimes required. Dean's relationship with his family was also becoming more strained during this period, as his mother and other family members began to notice changes in his behavior that made them uncomfortable. While they had no knowledge of his criminal activities, they could observe that he was becoming more secretive, more paranoid, and more isolated from the community relationships that had previously been important to him. These observations created additional stress for Dean, as he was forced to work harder to maintain the facade of normalcy that protected him from suspicion. The summer of 1973 was marked by increasing tensions between Dean and his accomplices that reflected the psychological strain of their prolonged criminal partnership. Both Brooks and Henley were beginning to express doubts about the sustainability of their activities and to question whether the benefits they received from their participation were worth the increasing risks they were taking. These doubts created new challenges for Dean, who was forced to work harder to maintain their loyalty and cooperation while dealing with his own deteriorating mental state. The psychological evolution of Henley during this period was particularly troubling for Dean, as the young man was developing his own ideas about how their criminal enterprise should be operated and was becoming less willing to accept Dean's authority without question. Henley's growing independence and confidence were creating a challenge to Dean's traditional role as the unquestioned leader of the group, and this challenge was becoming a source of increasing conflict between them. The conflicts between Dean and Henley were exacerbated by their different approaches to selecting and acquiring victims. While Dean preferred to target victims who could be easily controlled and who were unlikely to be missed quickly, Henley was more willing to take risks with victims who might be more difficult to control or whose disappearances might attract more attention. These differences in approach created operational challenges and increased the risk of exposure for their criminal activities. The psychological dynamics between Dean and his accomplices were further complicated by the fact that both Brooks and Henley had developed their own psychological investment in the crimes and their own sources of satisfaction from the violence they committed. This development meant that they were no longer simply following Dean's instructions or participating in his crimes solely for the benefits he provided them. Instead, they had become active partners in the criminal enterprise with their own motivations and agendas. As the summer of 1973 progressed, the tensions within Dean's criminal organization were approaching a crisis point that would ultimately lead to its destruction. The psychological strain of maintaining their activities was affecting all three participants in ways that made them less stable, less predictable, and more likely to make mistakes that could expose their crimes. The increasing attention from law enforcement and the community was making continued operations more risky and more difficult to sustain. Most importantly, the psychological dynamics that had allowed Dean to recruit and control his accomplices were breaking down in ways that threatened his ability to maintain his position as the dominant figure in the organization. Both Brooks and Henley had evolved beyond their original roles as subordinate accomplices and had developed their own sources of power and influence within the group. This evolution was creating the conditions for a power struggle that would ultimately prove to be fatal for Dean. The stage was now set for the dramatic confrontation that would bring Dean Corll's killing spree to an end and expose one of the most extensive and horrific series of murders in American criminal history. The psychological tensions that had been building within his criminal organization for months were about to explode into open conflict, leading to a violent confrontation that would forever change the lives of everyone involved and shock the nation with its revelations about the true extent of the Houston mass murders. The events of August 7th and 8th, 1973, would mark the end of one of the most horrific killing sprees in American history and begin the process of revealing the full extent of Dean Corll's crimes to a shocked nation. The final 24 hours of Dean's life were characterized by the same psychological tensions and violent impulses that had driven his criminal behavior for the previous 3 years. But they also marked a dramatic shift in the power dynamics that had governed his relationship with his accomplices. The night of August 7th, 1973, began like many others during the previous months, with Dean Corll making plans for what he intended to be another evening of torture and murder. However, the events that would unfold over the next few hours would be influenced by factors that Dean had not anticipated and could not control, ultimately leading to his death and the exposure of his crimes. One of the most significant factors that would influence the events of that final night was the psychological state of Elmer Wayne Henley, who had been experiencing increasing conflicts with Dean about the direction and management of their criminal activities. Henley had evolved from a reluctant accomplice to an active participant in murder, but he had also developed his own ideas about victim selection and operational procedures that were beginning to conflict with Dean's traditional methods. On the evening of August 7th, Henley made a decision that would prove to be fatal for Dean Corll. Rather than following their usual pattern of identifying and approaching male victims, Henley decided to invite two of his friends to Dean's house for what he described as a party. The friends he invited were Timothy Curley, a 15-year-old boy, and Rhonda Williams, a 15-year-old girl. The inclusion of a female guest represented a significant departure from their established pattern and would ultimately trigger the events that led to Dean's death. Henley's decision to invite a female guest to Dean's house was motivated by several factors that reflected his evolving relationship with Dean and his changing understanding of their criminal enterprise. In part, Henley was testing the boundaries of his authority within the organization and asserting his independence from Dean's control. He may also have been motivated by a desire to impress his friends or to provide them with what he believed would be a fun and exciting experience. However, Henley's decision also reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of Dean's psychological makeup and criminal methodology. Dean's crimes were driven by homosexual sadism and a specific need to dominate and control young males. The presence of a female victim would not only fail to satisfy these psychological needs, but would actually interfere with Dean's ability to achieve the kind of psychological and sexual gratification that he derived from his crimes. When Henley arrived at Dean's house on Lamar Street in Pasadena with his two friends, Dean's reaction was immediate and angry. He was furious that Henley had brought a girl to his house, viewing this as a violation of their established procedures and a sign of disrespect for his authority. The argument that followed would reveal the extent to which the psychological dynamics between Dean and his accomplices had deteriorated and would set in motion the events that would lead to Dean's death. The initial confrontation between Dean and Henley over the presence of Rhonda Williams was intense, but brief. Dean made it clear that he was angry about Henley's decision and that he viewed it as a serious breach of their operational protocols. However, rather than sending the guests away immediately, Dean decided to proceed with the evening's activities, apparently believing that he could adapt his plans to accommodate the unexpected situation. To defuse the immediate tension and to regain control of the situation, Dean suggested that the group engage in activities that had become routine during their previous gatherings. He provided his guests with alcohol and drugs, including spray paint that could be inhaled to produce intoxicating effects. These substances were part of Dean's standard methodology for incapacitating potential victims, making them easier to control and less likely to resist when he began the process of restraining and torturing them. The consumption of alcohol and inhalants had the intended effect of reducing the awareness and resistance of Dean's guests. Timothy Curley, Rhonda Williams, and even Elmer Wayne Henley became increasingly intoxicated as the evening progressed, eventually losing consciousness entirely. This loss of consciousness was exactly what Dean had been waiting for, as it provided him with the opportunity to begin implementing his plans for torturing and murdering his victims. When the three young people regained consciousness several hours later, they found themselves in a situation that was both terrifying and surreal. All three had been restrained with handcuffs and rope, making it impossible for them to move freely or to escape from Dean's house. They were also naked or partially clothed, indicating that Dean had begun the process of preparing them for the torture and sexual abuse that were central to his criminal methodology. The sight of his friends in restraints was a shock to Henley, who had not expected Dean to target them for victimization. Despite his extensive participation in Dean's crimes over the previous year, Henley had apparently believed that his relationship with Dean would protect his friends from becoming victims. The realization that Dean was willing to torture and murder his friends forced Henley to confront the true nature of their relationship and the extent of Dean's commitment to his criminal activities. Dean's behavior during this critical moment revealed important aspects of his psychological state and his understanding of the situation. Rather than recognizing the danger that Henley's shock and anger posed to his plans, Dean seemed to believe that he could continue to control the situation through the same combination of manipulation, threats, and violence that had been successful in the past. This miscalculation would prove to be fatal. The argument that erupted between Dean and Henley when Henley discovered his friends in restraints was the culmination of months of building tension between them. Henley was outraged that Dean had targeted his friends and demanded that they be released immediately. Dean, for his part, was determined to proceed with his plans and was unwilling to back down from what he saw as a challenge to his authority. The psychological dynamics of this confrontation were complex and reflected the evolution of the relationship between Dean and Henley over the previous 2 years. When Henley had first been recruited into Dean's criminal organization, he had been a vulnerable teenager who was dependent on Dean for guidance, support, and financial benefits. However, his extensive participation in multiple murders had transformed him into a confident and experienced killer who was no longer willing to accept Dean's authority without question. Dean's response to Henley's demands revealed the extent to which his psychological state had deteriorated during the previous months. Rather than attempting to negotiate with Henley or to find a compromise that might preserve their partnership, Dean became increasingly aggressive and threatening. He made it clear that he intended to proceed with his plans regardless of Henley's objections, and that he expected Henley to participate in the torture and murder of his friends. The turning point in the confrontation came when Henley managed to convince Dean to remove his handcuffs by promising to help with the torture and murder of Timothy Curley and Rhonda Williams. This promise was apparently convincing enough to persuade Dean that Henley had accepted the situation and was willing to participate in the crimes. However, Henley's actual intentions were quite different from what he had led Dean to believe. Once his hands were free, Henley began looking for an opportunity to gain control of the situation and to protect his friends from the fate that Dean had planned for them. His opportunity came when Dean became distracted by his preparations for torturing Timothy Curley and set down the .22 caliber pistol that he had been carrying. In that moment of distraction, Henley was able to grab the weapon and turn it on Dean. The confrontation that followed was brief, but decisive. Henley pointed the gun at Dean and demanded that he step away from the other victims and abandon his plans for torturing them. Dean's response to this threat revealed both his desperation and his fundamental misunderstanding of how much his relationship with Henley had changed. Rather than recognizing the seriousness of Henley's threat and attempting to defuse the situation, Dean chose to challenge Henley directly. According to Henley's later testimony, Dean's final words were a taunt that demonstrated his belief that Henley did not have the courage or commitment to actually shoot him. This miscalculation proved to be fatal, as Henley responded to Dean's challenge by firing the pistol multiple times, hitting Dean in the forehead, shoulder, and back. The man who had terrorized Houston for 3 years and had murdered at least 28 young men and boys was dead. The immediate aftermath of Dean's shooting was chaotic and emotionally charged for all of the survivors. Henley was in shock at what he had done, even though he had acted to protect himself and his friends. Timothy Curley and Rhonda Williams were traumatized by their experience and struggling to understand what had happened to them. All 3 survivors were also faced with the immediate practical challenge of deciding what to do next. The decision to contact law enforcement was made by Henley, who recognized that the situation had moved beyond anything that could be covered up or explained away. At 8:24 on the morning of August 8, 1973, Henley placed a call to the Pasadena Police Department and reported that he had shot and killed Dean Corll. This phone call marked the beginning of the process that would expose the full extent of Dean's crimes and shock the nation with revelations about one of the most extensive serial killing sprees in American history. When police officers arrived at Dean's house on Lamar Street, they found a scene that was both horrifying and puzzling. Dean's body lay on the floor, surrounded by evidence of the torture and murder activities that had been the focus of his life for the previous 3 years. The house contained restraints, torture devices, and other equipment that clearly indicated that serious crimes had been committed there, but the initial investigation could not have prepared the officers for the full scope of what they were about to discover. Henley's initial statements to police were focused on the events of the previous evening and his shooting of Dean Corll. He described the argument that had led to the shooting and his belief that he had acted in self-defense to protect himself and his friends from torture and murder. However, as the questioning continued, Henley began to reveal information that would transform the investigation from a simple homicide case into one of the largest and most complex murder investigations in American history. The breakthrough moment in the investigation came when Henley, Perhaps overwhelmed by the enormity of what he had been involved in and seeking to unburden himself of the psychological weight of his crimes, began to tell police about the murders that he and Dean had committed together. His initial admissions were tentative and carefully worded, but they quickly escalated into a full confession that revealed the existence of multiple victims buried in various locations around the Houston area. Henley's decision to confess was influenced by several factors that reflected his psychological state and his understanding of his situation. He recognized that the physical evidence at Dean's house would inevitably lead to further investigation, and that his own involvement in Dean's crimes would eventually be discovered. He may also have been motivated by a desire to take credit for ending Dean's killing spree and to position himself as someone who had ultimately acted to protect potential victims. The confession also reflected Henley's need to unburden himself of the psychological weight of his participation in multiple murders. The prolonged period of killing and torture had taken a significant toll on his mental health, and the dramatic events of the previous evening had brought these psychological pressures to a breaking point. The confession provided him with an opportunity to acknowledge what he had done and to begin the process of dealing with the consequences of his actions. As Henley's confession continued, the scope of the investigation expanded rapidly. He provided police with information about multiple burial sites, including the boat storage shed in southwest Houston that had served as the primary disposal location for Dean's victims. He also provided details about the methods that Dean had used to torture and kill his victims, information that would prove to be crucial in understanding the full extent of the crimes and in identifying the remains that would be discovered in the coming days. The revelation of the boat storage shed location was particularly significant because it provided police with their first concrete lead about where to find physical evidence of Dean's crimes. Henley agreed to accompany officers to the shed and to assist in the location of buried remains, beginning a process that would ultimately reveal the bodies of 17 victims and confirm the existence of one of the most extensive burial sites in American criminal history. The discovery of the first body at the boat storage shed marked the beginning of our investigation that would shock the nation and forever change the way Americans understood the reality of serial murder. The systematic excavation of the burial site would reveal evidence of torture, sexual abuse, and murder on a scale that had never been seen before in American criminal history, establishing Dean Corll as one of the most prolific and sadistic serial killers in the nation's history. The events of August 8, 1973, marked not only the end of Dean Corll's life, but also the beginning of a legal and investigative process that would continue for several years. The discoveries that would be made in the coming days and weeks would reveal the full scope of Dean's crimes and would force American society to confront the reality that such extensive and systematic violence could occur without detection for such a long period of time. The morning of August 8, 1973, marked the beginning of one of the most extensive and horrifying criminal investigations in American history. As Elmer Wayne Henley led police officers to the boat storage facility in southwest Houston where he claimed Dean Corll had buried multiple victims, law enforcement officials could not have imagined the scope of the discoveries they were about to make or the impact those discoveries would have on the Houston community and the nation as a whole. The Southwest Storage Facility where Henley directed police was located in an industrial area of Houston that was sparsely populated and rarely visited by casual observers. This location had been carefully chosen by Dean Corll as a disposal site because it offered privacy, security, and easy access for someone who needed to transport and bury bodies without being observed. The facility consisted of numerous individual storage units rented by various customers for legitimate purposes, making it an ideal location for concealing evidence of criminal activity. When police officers first entered storage unit number 11, which had been rented by Dean Corll, they were confronted with a scene that appeared to be relatively normal storage facility. The unit contained a half-stripped car that had been stolen from a used car lot, a child's bicycle, empty bags of lime, and boxes of teenage boys' clothing. However, these seemingly innocuous items would prove to be evidence of crimes far more extensive and horrific than anyone had initially imagined. The first indication that the storage unit contained something more sinister than stolen property came when officers noticed the unusual condition of the floor. The earth beneath their feet was soft and had an unusual texture that suggested it had been disturbed recently and repeatedly over an extended period of time. The presence of lime bags and the distinctive smell that permeated the unit suggested that something had been buried beneath the floor that was organic in nature and in various stages of decomposition. The excavation of the storage unit floor began on the afternoon of August 8, 1973, with officers using shovels and other hand tools to carefully remove layers of earth while looking for evidence of buried remains. The process was slow and methodical, as investigators were careful to preserve any evidence they might uncover while also being prepared for the horrific discoveries that Henley's confession had led them to expect. The first body was discovered within a few hours of beginning the excavation. The remains were those of a young man who had been wrapped in clear plastic sheeting and buried beneath a layer of lime that had been intended to accelerate decomposition and reduce odors. The condition of the body and the method of burial immediately confirmed that Henley's confession was accurate and that they were dealing with evidence of systematic murder and body disposal. As the excavation continued through the night and into the following day, additional bodies were discovered at regular intervals throughout the storage unit floor. Each discovery revealed evidence of the same careful burial methodology, with bodies wrapped in plastic, treated with lime, and buried in shallow graves that had been precisely positioned to maximize the use of available space. The systematic nature of the burials demonstrated that this location had been used repeatedly over an extended period of time, and that the person responsible had developed efficient procedures for disposing of multiple victims. The psychological impact of these discoveries on the police officers and other personnel involved in the investigation was profound and lasting. Many of the officers who participated in the excavation had never been exposed to evidence of such systematic and extensive violence, and the experience of uncovering body after body of tortured and murdered young men was traumatic for even the most experienced investigators. The investigation required the involvement of numerous personnel from multiple law enforcement agencies, all of whom were affected by the horrific nature of what they were discovering. As the excavation of the boat storage facility continued, the number of bodies discovered quickly exceeded any previous mass murder case in American history. By the time the search was completed, investigators had recovered the remains of 17 victims from the storage unit, establishing it as one of the most extensive burial sites ever discovered in the United States. The scale of the discoveries forced law enforcement agencies to completely reorganize their investigation and to bring in additional resources and expertise to handle the unprecedented scope of the case. The identification of the victims discovered at the storage facility presented significant challenges for investigators, as many of the remains were in advanced stages of decomposition and had been deliberately damaged or mutilated before burial. The process of identification required the use of dental records, medical records, and other forensic evidence, and it involved extensive cooperation between law enforcement agencies and the families of missing persons who might be among the victims. As the identity of the victims began to be established, the true scope of Dean Corll's crimes became apparent to the Houston community and the nation. Many of the young men whose remains were discovered at the storage facility had been reported missing over the previous 3 years, but their disappearances had been dismissed by police as runaways or other non-criminal explanations. The discovery of their bodies forced law enforcement agencies to acknowledge that they had failed to recognize the pattern of disappearances and had missed opportunities to investigate and potentially prevent additional murders. The revelation that so many missing persons cases were actually murder victims had a profound impact on the families who had been searching for their missing sons and brothers. Many of these families had spent months or years hoping for the safe return of their loved ones, and the discovery of their remains brought both relief at finally knowing what had happened and devastating grief at learning the horrific circumstances of their deaths. Henley's cooperation with the investigation extended beyond his assistance with a boat storage facility excavation. As the scope of Dean's crimes became apparent, Henley provided additional information about other burial sites where victims had been disposed of, leading to the discovery of additional remains at locations around the Houston area. This cooperation was motivated both by his desire to unburden himself of the psychological weight of his crimes and by his recognition that full cooperation might result in more favorable treatment by the criminal justice system. One of the additional burial sites identified by Henley was located near Lake Sam Rayburn, where Dean's family owned a lakeside cabin. This location had been used for the disposal of victims who had been subjected to particularly prolonged torture sessions, or who had special significance to Dean for other reasons. The remote location of this burial site made it ideal for concealing evidence, and the soft soil near the water made digging graves relatively easy and quick. The excavation of the Lake Sam Rayburn burial site revealed additional victims and provided further evidence of the systematic nature of Dean's crimes. The bodies discovered at this location showed evidence of the same torture methods and disposal techniques that had been used at the boat storage facility, confirming that these were all victims of the same killer and that Dean had developed consistent procedures for handling his crimes regardless of the specific burial location used. Another burial site identified by Henley was located at High Island Beach, a remote coastal area that provided privacy and easy disposal of evidence. This location had been used for some of Dean's earliest victims, including Jeffrey Conan, who had been killed in September 1970 and whose murder had marked the beginning of Dean's systematic killing spree. The discovery of remains at High Island Beach provided investigators with evidence that connected Dean's crimes to missing persons cases dating back to the very beginning of his criminal career. The excavation of the High Island Beach burial site was complicated by environmental factors that had affected the preservation of evidence over the extended period since the murders had been committed. The coastal environment and weather conditions had accelerated the decomposition of remains and had made the identification of victims more difficult than at the other burial sites. However, the discovery of bodies at this location provided crucial evidence about the timeline and evolution of Dean's crimes and helped to establish the full scope of his killing spree. As the investigation continued and additional burial sites were excavated, the total number of confirmed victims continued to grow. The final count of 28 confirmed victims established Dean Corll as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history and made the Houston mass murders the largest serial killing case that had been discovered in the United States at that time. However, investigators suspected that the actual number of victims might be even higher, as there were indications that additional burial sites might exist that had not yet been discovered. The process of identifying victims and notifying their families was one of the most challenging and emotionally difficult aspects of the entire investigation. Many of the families had been searching for their missing sons for months or years, and the confirmation that their loved ones had been murdered was devastating news that forever changed their lives. The notification process required sensitivity and compassion from law enforcement personnel, who were also struggling to process the emotional impact of the investigation. The media coverage of the Houston mass murders was extensive and unprecedented, with reporters from around the world traveling to Houston to cover the story. The scale and systematic nature of the crimes captured public attention in a way that few criminal cases had before, and the investigation became a major national news story that was followed closely by media outlets across the country. The coverage helped to raise public awareness about the reality of serial murder and the need for better procedures for investigating missing persons cases. The discovery of Dean Corll's crimes also had a significant impact on law enforcement practices and procedures, particularly in relation to missing persons investigations. The case demonstrated that patterns of disappearances could indicate the presence of a serial killer and that law enforcement agencies needed to be more proactive in investigating and coordinating missing persons cases. The lessons learned from the Houston mass murders investigation led to improvements in communication between law enforcement agencies and better procedures for recognizing and investigating potential serial crimes. The forensic investigation of the physical evidence recovered from the burial sites provided important insights into Dean's criminal methodology and psychological profile. The torture devices and restraints found at his residence, combined with the evidence of systematic torture and sexual abuse found on the victim's remains, painted a picture of a killer who derived psychological satisfaction from inflicting prolonged suffering on his victims. This evidence was crucial in helping investigators and psychologists understand the motivations behind Dean's crimes and the factors that had enabled him to continue killing for such an extended period. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Dean had been able to maintain a facade of normalcy while conducting his killing spree. Neighbors and acquaintances described him as a quiet, polite man who seemed to care about children and who had no apparent criminal history. This disconnect between Dean's public persona and his secret criminal activities demonstrated the difficulty of identifying serial killers before they are caught, and the importance of being alert to warning signs that might indicate dangerous behavior. As the immediate investigation phase concluded, and the full scope of Dean's crimes became apparent, attention turned to the legal proceedings that would determine the fate of his surviving accomplices. Both David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley had confessed to participating in multiple murders, and their trials would be closely watched by the public and the media as the criminal justice system attempted to determine appropriate punishment for their roles in one of the most extensive serial killing sprees in American history. The discovery phase of the Houston mass murders investigation had revealed the existence of one of the most systematic and extensive series of murders in American criminal history. The 28 confirmed victims, the multiple burial sites, and the evidence of prolonged torture and sexual abuse established Dean Corll as one of the most prolific and sadistic serial killers in the nation's history. The investigation had also exposed significant failures in law enforcement procedures and had led to important changes in how missing persons cases are investigated and how potential serial crimes are recognized and investigated. The impact of these discoveries extended far beyond the immediate Houston area, influencing national conversations about crime, law enforcement, and the protection of vulnerable young people. The case became a landmark in American criminal history and established new standards for the investigation of serial crimes and the prosecution of accomplices to mass murder. The legacy of the Houston mass murders would continue to influence criminal justice practices and public awareness about serial violence for decades to come. The legal proceedings that followed the discovery of Dean Corll's crimes represented one of the most complex and closely watched series of criminal trials in American history. The prosecution of David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley for their roles in the Houston mass murders raised unprecedented questions about criminal responsibility, the psychology of accomplices to serial murder, and the appropriate punishment for individuals who had participated in such extensive and horrific crimes. The decision to prosecute both Brooks and Henley for murder was not without controversy, as both men had clearly been victims of Dean Corll's manipulation and abuse before becoming his accomplices. However, the evidence of their active participation in multiple murders, including their own testimony about personally killing victims, made it clear that they could not be treated simply as victims who had been coerced into criminal activity. The legal system was forced to grapple with the complex question of how to balance the recognition of their victimization with the need to hold them accountable for their crimes. The prosecution strategy focused on establishing that both Brooks and Henley had voluntarily participated in the murders and had derived personal benefit from their involvement in Dean's criminal enterprise. Prosecutors argued that while the defendants had initially been victims of Dean's manipulation, they had eventually become willing partners in his crimes who had made conscious decisions to participate in torture and murder. The evidence presented at trial included their own confessions, physical evidence from the crime scenes, and testimony from the surviving victims of Dean's final night. The defense strategy for both defendants centered on their youth, their troubled backgrounds, and the extensive psychological manipulation they had suffered at Dean's hands. Defense attorneys argued that both men had been groomed and corrupted by an adult predator who had systematically destroyed their moral development and had coerced them into participating in crimes they would never have committed on their own. The defense emphasized the power imbalance between Dean and his young accomplices and argued that they should be viewed primarily as victims rather than as criminals. Elmer Wayne Henley's trial began first, in July 1974, in San Antonio, Texas. The decision to move the trial to San Antonio was made because of the extensive media coverage the case had received in Houston, which made it impossible to find an impartial jury in the city where the crimes had been committed. The trial attracted national attention and was covered extensively by media outlets from around the country, making it one of the most publicized criminal trials of the decade. The prosecution's case against Henley was built around his own confessions and the testimony of other witnesses who had knowledge of his participation in the murders. Henley had admitted to personally killing at least 6 victims and to participating in the abduction and torture of numerous others. The prosecution also presented evidence about the torture methods used by Dean and his accomplices, including photographs of the torture board and other devices that had been found at Dean's residence. The defense's case for Henley emphasized his youth, his troubled family background, and the psychological manipulation he had suffered at Dean's hands. Defense attorneys presented testimony from psychologists and social workers who described the effects of childhood abuse and trauma on psychological development, arguing that Henley's capacity for moral reasoning had been severely compromised by his experiences. They also emphasized that Henley had ultimately acted to end Dean's killing spree by shooting him, positioning this act as evidence of his fundamental moral capacity. The trial included dramatic testimony from Henley himself, who took the stand to describe his involvement in the murders and his relationship with Dean Corll. His testimony provided the jury with a first-hand account of the psychological dynamics that had governed the criminal organization and the methods that Dean had used to recruit and control his accomplices. Henley's testimony was both compelling and disturbing, as it revealed the extent to which he had been both a victim and a perpetrator of horrific crimes. The jury in Henley's trial deliberated for only 90 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty on all 6 murder charges. This relatively quick deliberation suggested that the jurors had not been persuaded by the defense arguments about Henley's diminished responsibility and had concluded that he should be held fully accountable for his participation in the murders. The speed of the verdict also reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against Henley and the difficulty of justifying his actions regardless of the circumstances that had led to his involvement. Henley was sentenced to 6 consecutive 99-year prison terms, effectively ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The length of the sentence reflected the severity of his crimes and the court's determination to impose the maximum possible punishment for his participation in the murders. The sentence also served as a deterrent to others who might be tempted to participate in similar crimes and as a statement about society's condemnation of such extreme violence. However, Henley's legal saga did not end with his initial conviction and sentencing. In 1978, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned his conviction on the grounds that the trial should have been moved to a different venue to ensure an impartial jury. The appellate court found that the extensive media coverage of the case had made it impossible for Henley to receive a fair trial in San Antonio and ordered that he be retried in a different location. Henley's retrial took place in 1979 and once again resulted in a conviction on all 6 murder charges. However, this time he was sentenced to 6 concurrent 99-year terms rather than consecutive sentences, effectively reducing his minimum time before eligibility for parole. The change in sentencing reflected evolving attitudes about criminal justice and rehabilitation, as well as recognition of the complex circumstances that had led to Henley's involvement in the crimes. David Brooks's trial followed a similar pattern, though it received somewhat less media attention than Henley's proceedings. Brooks was charged with murder in connection with one of the deaths, and like Henley, he was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The prosecution's case against Brooks was built around his own confessions and his lengthy involvement with Dean Corll, which predated Henley's recruitment and involvement in the crimes. The defense strategy for Brooks emphasized many of the same themes that had been used in Henley's defense, including his youth at the time of his initial recruitment, his troubled family background, and the extensive psychological manipulation he had suffered. Defense attorneys argued that Brooks had been systematically groomed and abused by Dean from the age of 12, and that his participation in the murders was the result of this prolonged victimization rather than his own criminal inclinations. Brooks's trial was notable for the extensive testimony about the psychological dynamics of the relationship between Dean and his accomplices. Expert witnesses described the process by which predators groom their victims and gradually escalate their demands for participation in criminal activity. This testimony helped to explain how 2 seemingly normal teenagers could be transformed into accomplices to serial murder and provided important insights into the psychology of criminal partnerships. The conviction and sentencing of both Brooks and Henley marked the end of the formal legal proceedings related to the Houston mass murders, but the impact of the case continued to reverberate through the criminal justice system and American society. The trials had established important precedents about the prosecution of accomplices to serial murder and had provided valuable insights into the psychological dynamics that enable such crimes to occur. The case also had a significant impact on law enforcement practices and procedures, particularly in relation to missing persons investigations and the recognition of serial crime patterns. The failure of law enforcement agencies agencies to recognize the pattern of disappearances in the Houston Heights area and to connect them to a single perpetrator had allowed Dean's crimes to continue for much longer than they might have if proper investigative procedures had been in place. In response to the lessons learned from the Houston mass murders, law enforcement agencies across the country began to develop better procedures for investigating missing persons cases and for recognizing potential patterns that might indicate serial criminal activity. These improvements included better communication between different law enforcement agencies, more systematic tracking of missing persons cases, and training for officers in recognizing the signs of potential serial crimes. The case also contributed to growing public awareness about the reality of serial murder and the need for better protection of vulnerable young people. The Houston mass murders occurred at a time when the concept of serial killing was not well understood by the general public, and the extensive media coverage of the case helped to educate people about the dangers posed by such criminals and the importance of reporting suspicious behavior. The psychological impact of the Houston mass murders on the victims' families was profound and lasting. Many families had spent months or years searching for their missing sons, and the discovery that their loved ones had been tortured and murdered was devastating news that forever changed their lives. The families became advocates for better missing persons investigations and for improved support services for the families of crime victims. The impact on the Houston Heights community was equally significant, as residents struggled to understand how such extensive and systematic violence could have occurred in their neighborhood without being detected. The revelation that Dean Corll had been operating from their community for years while maintaining a facade of respectability forced residents to reevaluate their assumptions about safety and security and to develop new awareness of potential dangers. The case also had important implications for understanding the psychology of serial murder and the factors that enable such crimes to occur. The extensive documentation of Dean's criminal methodology and the testimony of his accomplices provided researchers and law enforcement personnel with valuable insights into the development and operation of serial killing enterprises. This information has been used to improve criminal profiling techniques and to develop better strategies for investigating and preventing serial crimes. The trials of Brooks and Henley also raised important questions about criminal responsibility and the treatment of accomplices to serious crimes. The complex circumstances that had led to their involvement in the murders challenged traditional notions of criminal culpability and forced the legal system to grapple with questions about the extent to which individuals can be held responsible for crimes committed under the influence of extreme psychological manipulation. As the immediate aftermath of the trials concluded and public attention began to shift to other matters, the long-term impact of the Houston mass murders continued to unfold. Both Brooks and Henley remained in prison, serving their life sentences and becoming subjects of ongoing study by psychologists and criminologists interested in understanding the factors that had led to their transformation from victims to perpetrators. The case became a landmark in American criminal history and continued to influence criminal justice practices, law enforcement procedures, and public awareness about serial violence for decades to come. The legacy of the Houston mass murders serves as a reminder of the importance of vigilance in protecting vulnerable members of society and of the need for continued improvement in the systems designed to prevent and investigate serious crimes. The story of Dean Corll and the Houston mass murders also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency and the importance of taking seriously the concerns of families and community members who report suspicious behavior or missing persons. The failure to recognize the pattern of disappearances in the Houston Heights area represents a missed opportunity that might have prevented additional murders if proper investigative procedures had been in place. The 28 confirmed victims of Dean Corll's killing spree were not merely statistics in one of America's most horrific serial murder cases, but young men and boys with their own dreams, personalities, families, and futures that were brutally cut short. Each victim represented a life full of potential that was destroyed by Dean's insatiable appetite for violence and control, and each death left behind grieving families and communities that would never fully recover from their loss. Jeffrey Allen Conan, the first known victim of Dean Corll's killing spree, was an 18-year-old college freshman at the University of Texas who was simply trying to get home to see his family when he encountered Dean on September 25, 1970. Conan was described by those who knew him as an intelligent and ambitious young man who was pursuing his education with dedication and who maintained close relationships with his family despite the distance between his college and his home in Houston. The circumstances of Conan's disappearance were typical of many college students of that era, as hitchhiking was a common and generally accepted method of transportation for young people who did not have access to cars. Conan had been traveling with a fellow student from Austin to Houston when they became separated, leaving him alone and vulnerable to Dean's predatory behavior. His acceptance of what appeared to be a helpful ride from a friendly stranger ultimately cost him his life and marked the beginning of one of the most extensive killing sprees in American history. James Glass and Danny Yates were the next known victims, both 14 years old when they were murdered in December 1970. Both boys were familiar to David Brooks from the Houston Heights neighborhood, which made them easier targets for recruitment and abduction. Glass and Yates represented the beginning of Dean's systematic targeting of young people from his immediate community, a pattern that would characterize most of his subsequent crimes. The murders of Glass and Yates were significant not only because they represented an escalation in Dean's criminal behavior, but also because they established the pattern of using local connections and relationships to identify and approach potential victims. The fact that these boys were known to Brooks made their abduction less suspicious and provided Dean with valuable information about their habits, schedules, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited during the recruitment process. Donald and Jerry Waldrop were brothers, aged 15 and 13 respectively, who were abducted and murdered together on January 30th, 1971. The killing of siblings represented a particularly cruel aspect of Dean's crimes, as it doubled the impact on their family and demonstrated his willingness to destroy entire family units in pursuit of his psychological gratification. The Waldrop brothers were among the victims buried in the boat storage shed, where their remains were discovered during the initial excavation in August 1973. Randall Lee Harvey was a 15-year-old boy who worked part-time at a gas station in Oak Forest and was last seen by his family on March 9, 1971, as he cycled toward his workplace. Harvey's murder was significant because it demonstrated Dean's willingness to target victims who had regular employment and established routines, rather than limiting himself to transient or troubled young people who might be less likely to be missed. The selection of Harvey as a victim also illustrated Dean's evolving methodology for identifying and approaching potential targets. Rather than relying solely on his accomplices to recruit victims from their social circles, Dean was beginning to actively hunt for victims among the general population of young people in the Houston area. This evolution represented a significant escalation in risk-taking behavior that would eventually contribute to his downfall. David Hillegiest was a 13-year-old boy whose disappearance on May 29, 1971, had a profound impact on the Houston Heights community and would eventually lead to Dean's recruitment of Elmer Wayne Henley as an accomplice. Hillegiest was a well-known and well-liked boy in the neighborhood, and his disappearance triggered an extensive search effort that demonstrated the close-knit nature of the community and the deep concern that residents felt for their missing children. The irony of Hillegiest's disappearance was that his lifelong friend Elmer Wayne Henley volunteered to help distribute missing person posters and search for him, not knowing that the boy he was looking for had already been murdered by the man who would soon recruit